Canada is quietly making a major move in the aluminum industry, and it could have consequences far beyond the metal itself. For years, Canada and the United States operated one of the world's most integrated aluminum supply chains. Canadian aluminum moved south. American manufacturers turned that aluminum into cars, aircraft, cans, construction products, and countless other goods. The relationship was efficient, it was profitable, and for decades, both sides had a strong incentive to keep it working. But that model is now under pressure. Washington has imposed heavy tariffs on imported aluminum. Canada has responded with its own measures, and instead of simply waiting for the United States to return to the old trading system, Canada is beginning to build a different strategy. A strategy based on three things: protect Canadian production, develop cleaner, higher-value aluminum, and find more customers outside the United States. That is why Canada's latest aluminum moves deserve attention, because this is no longer simply a fight over tariffs, it is becoming a fight over supply chains. And supply chains determine who has economic power. Let's start with what Canada actually announced. On May 29th, Canada's federal government announced a $100 million investment in the Elias Aluminum Technology Project. The money is supporting a larger $440 million project led by Rio Tinto Alcan. The goal is to develop and demonstrate a new aluminum smelting technology designed to eliminate direct greenhouse gas emissions from the traditional smelting process. The Canadian government describes ELYS as potentially transformative technology for low-carbon aluminum production. And that matters because aluminum is not just another commodity. It is essential to some of the most important industries in the modern economy. Automobiles use aluminum, aircraft use aluminum, construction uses aluminum, energy infrastructure uses aluminum, packaging uses aluminum, defense industries use aluminum. And as the global economy moves toward electric vehicles, renewable energy, and more efficient transportation, demand for lightweight metals is expected to remain strategically important. Canada therefore sees aluminum as part of its industrial strategy, and there is a reason Canada has an advantage. A large portion of Canadian aluminum production is powered by hydroelectricity. That gives Canadian producers a lower carbon electricity source than many competitors around the world. So Canada is trying to turn that advantage into a commercial strategy. Instead of simply selling aluminum as a raw material, Canada wants to become a major supplier of low-carbon, high-value aluminum. That could become extremely important as governments and companies begin paying more attention to the carbon footprint of their supply chains. But there is a much more immediate problem: the United States. Washington has been using tariffs to protect and expand American metal production, and the pressure on Canadian aluminum has been enormous. The U.S. currently maintains Section 232 tariffs on aluminum imports. Canada's Trade Commissioner Service says aluminum and related products can face tariffs ranging from 10% to 50% depending on the product and applicable measures. That has changed the economics of the Canada-US aluminum trade, and Canada is not simply absorbing the impact. The market is responding. In May, Reuters reported that Canadian aluminum producers were increasingly redirecting shipments toward Europe. Why? Because the economics were changing. The United States had imposed a 50% tariff on aluminum. At the same time, European buyers were facing a supply shortage. The result was a dramatic increase in European aluminum premiums. Reuters reported that European premiums had risen 73% since the beginning of the Iran war, reaching a record $621 per metric ton. At the same time, the U.S. Midwest premium reached a record level of approximately $2,557 per ton. This created a remarkable situation. American buyers still wanted Canadian aluminum. European buyers wanted Canadian aluminum, and Canada suddenly had more choices about where to send it. That is the part Washington needs to watch, because tariffs are supposed to make imported aluminum more expensive and encourage production inside the United States. But tariffs can also change where exporters sell. And that is exactly what began happening. Reuters reported that Canadian aluminum shipments to Europe increased sharply. Canadian deliveries to Europe had risen 276% from 2024 levels to more than 590,000 tons in 2025. Meanwhile, deliveries to the United States fell by 25% to around 2 million tons. Those numbers show that supply chains can adapt. They may not adapt overnight, and the United States remains Canada's most important aluminum customer. But once producers establish alternative markets, those relationships can become permanent, and that could be the long-term consequence of the tariff strategy. Canada may have been pushed to diversify faster than it otherwise would have. Now, that does not mean Canada can simply replace the United States. Geography still matters. The American market is enormous. The two countries share a border. Canadian producers have decades of relationships with American manufacturers, and much of the existing transportation infrastructure was built around North American trade, so the United States will remain extremely important, but dependence is a different question. If Canadian aluminum producers have only one major market, Washington has enormous leverage. If they have several major markets, that leverage becomes smaller. And Canada appears increasingly determined to create those alternatives. Europe is the obvious example. Europe has a significant structural need for aluminum. Its own production is not enough to satisfy demand, and the geopolitical environment has made reliable supply chains more important. The loss of production in some regions, combined with disruptions in the Middle East, has tightened the global market. That makes Canadian aluminum especially attractive. Canada can offer something European buyers increasingly value: reliable production from a politically stable country, powered largely by hydroelectricity, and there is another advantage. Low-carbon aluminum is becoming strategically important. Companies are under pressure to reduce emissions throughout their supply chains. Automakers want lighter vehicles with lower embedded emissions. Aircraft manufacturers are looking for lower carbon materials. Packaging companies are facing pressure to reduce the environmental impact of their products, and governments are increasingly creating regulations that reward cleaner production. Canada wants to position itself at the center of that transition. That is where the ELYSIS investment becomes much more significant. The $100 million federal contribution is not simply a bailout for an aluminum company. It is an attempt to develop technology that could change how aluminum is produced. Traditional aluminum smelting generates carbon dioxide because of the chemistry involved in the process. ALYS is designed to replace the carbon anode with an alternative material. The intended result is aluminum production without direct greenhouse gas emissions from the smelting process. If the technology can be successfully commercialized at scale, Canada could have something much more valuable than cheap electricity. It could have a technological advantage. And that is exactly what Canada needs if it wants to compete in a global market. Because Canada cannot win every aluminum battle by simply producing more metal. It has to produce aluminum that customers are willing to pay more for. Cleaner aluminum, lower carbon aluminum, more advanced aluminum, aluminum integrated into high-value manufacturing. That is a different strategy from simply exporting raw material, and it fits into a much larger Canadian economic shift. Ottawa is increasingly talking about economic resilience. The government extended key steel and aluminum tariff measures for another year in June. It also maintained temporary tariff relief for certain U.S. steel and aluminum products that Canadian manufacturers rely on. At first, that may sound contradictory. Why would Canada impose measures against foreign metal while still allowing certain American aluminum products to enter? Because the government is trying to protect Canadian producers without damaging Canadian manufacturers that need imported inputs. That is the difficult balance. Protect the domestic industry, but do not make Canadian factories uncompetitive. Support Canadian supply chains, but do not cut off essential American inputs, and at the same time, find new foreign customers. This is not easy, but Ottawa is using several tools simultaneously: tariff measures, financial support, domestic procurement, technology investment, and export diversification. Canada's Buy Canadian policy is another part of the strategy. The federal government has said major procurement projects will prioritize Canadian suppliers and require the use of Canadian steel and aluminum in major federal projects. The idea is straightforward. If the government is spending billions of dollars on infrastructure, transportation, defense, and other projects, Canadian companies should have an opportunity to supply those materials. That creates domestic demand. Domestic demand helps stabilize production, and stable production makes it easier for companies to invest. Then there is financing. Canada has established a $5 billion Strategic Response Fund and a $1 billion Business Development Bank of Canada financing program for metal manufacturers and exporters. These programs are designed to help companies survive the tariff shock and continue investing. That is important because aluminum production is extremely capital intensive. Smelters cost billions. Energy infrastructure costs billions. Modernization costs billions. And new technology can take years to commercialize. Companies cannot make those investments if they believe the market could disappear overnight. Government support is therefore intended to give producers time to adjust. But there is another reason Canada is investing in aluminum: national security. Aluminum is used in aerospace, defense, transportation, energy, and infrastructure. A country that cannot produce strategic materials domestically becomes vulnerable during a major supply disruption. Canada therefore wants to maintain its ability to produce aluminum at scale, and the United States has the same concern. That is one reason Washington has been so aggressive about domestic aluminum production. On July 20th, President Donald Trump signed a proclamation designed to encourage investment in American primary aluminum smelters. The administration is offering companies incentives to build, expand, or refurbish U.S. smelters. Companies that commit to new American production can potentially receive tariff benefits on a corresponding level of imported primary aluminum. The message from Washington is clear. The United States wants more aluminum production inside the country. But there is a problem. Building aluminum smelters is expensive. It requires enormous amounts of electricity. It requires long-term investment, and it takes years. Canada already has large-scale production capacity. That means American manufacturers cannot instantly replace Canadian supplies. And that creates a dilemma. Washington wants to reduce dependence on foreign aluminum, but American manufacturers still need aluminum. So tariffs can raise costs even as the United States tries to expand domestic production. That is why Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has argued that American buyers are bearing much of the cost of the aluminum tariffs. And according to recent reporting, U.S. aluminum prices have risen significantly. This is the basic problem with tariffs. They can protect domestic producers, but they can also increase costs for companies that use the imported material. If an American automaker buys more expensive aluminum, the cost can eventually move through the supply chain. It can affect car prices, it can affect beverage packaging, it can affect construction, it can affect aircraft production, and it can affect thousands of smaller manufacturers. That is why aluminum has become such an important bargaining issue between Ottawa and Washington. And now the timing is becoming critical. Canada and the United States are negotiating again. Reuters reported on August 7th that Ottawa and Washington were discussing potential concessions as Canada tries to avoid another round of U.S. tariffs scheduled for August 19th. One possibility being discussed is tariff relief for Canadian steel and aluminum. In exchange, Canada could make concessions in other areas, including automobiles and dairy quotas. Nothing is guaranteed, but the fact that aluminum tariff relief is part of the discussion tells you how important this sector has become. Canada has something the United States needs. The United States has something Canada needs, and both sides are trying to use that leverage. That is what makes aluminum strategically important. It is not simply about metal. It is about manufacturing, it is about energy, it is about technology, it is about jobs, it is about supply chains, and increasingly it is about geopolitical leverage. Now imagine the situation from Canada's perspective. For decades, Canadian aluminum producers could focus heavily on the United States. The market was nearby, the infrastructure was established, and demand was enormous. Then tariffs changed the equation. Suddenly, European buyers became more attractive, prices moved, shipping patterns changed. And Canadian producers discovered that they could sell more outside North America. That does not mean Europe will replace the United States, but it creates another option. And once that option exists, it becomes strategically valuable. Canada can negotiate with Washington while simultaneously developing customers in Europe. It can invest in low-carbon production while global companies are looking for cleaner materials. It can strengthen domestic supply chains while continuing to participate in North American manufacturing. That is a much stronger position than simply waiting for the United States to change its tariff policy, and it could become a model for other Canadian industries. The same logic is already appearing in energy. Canada is developing LNG exports to Europe. It is seeking greater access to India. It is pursuing new relationships in the Middle East. It is developing critical mineral partnerships, and it is investing in infrastructure that can move Canadian products to global markets. Aluminum fits directly into that broader strategy. The goal is not to abandon the United States. The goal is to make sure Canada has choices. And there is a major economic opportunity hiding inside that strategy: green aluminum. The world is moving toward lower carbon manufacturing. That means the carbon footprint of materials is increasingly becoming part of the product itself. A car manufacturer may not only ask, how much does this aluminum cost? It may also ask, how much carbon was emitted to produce it? Where did it come from? Can we verify its environmental footprint, and can we use it to meet our own emissions targets? If Canada can answer those questions better than competitors, its aluminum could command a premium. That is the long-term bet behind Alliance. Canada is betting that cleaner production will become a competitive advantage, and if that happens, Canada could move up the value chain. Instead of competing only on price, it competes on technology, sustainability, and reliability. That is a much harder advantage for competitors to copy, but there are risks. The technology still has to be commercialized. European demand can change, commodity prices can fall, shipping costs can rise, and American tariffs can change again. There is also the risk that the United States successfully expands domestic production. If American companies build enough new smelting capacity, demand for Canadian imports could eventually fall. That is why Canada cannot depend on one alternative market either. Europe cannot become the new United States. Canada needs multiple customers. And that means the aluminum strategy must be part of a much broader diversification strategy. Canada needs to sell more products to more countries. It needs better ports, better railways, more processing, more manufacturing, and more high-value exports. The aluminum sector is therefore becoming a test case. Can Canada take a traditional resource industry and turn it into a strategic, low-carbon, technology-driven industry? If the answer is yes, the benefits could extend far beyond aluminum. It could create highly skilled jobs, it could attract investment, it could support aerospace and automotive manufacturing, it could strengthen Canada's defense industrial base, and it could create a product that is increasingly valuable in a world focused on reducing emissions. That is why Ottawa is putting money behind the industry. And that is why Washington is paying attention. Because the United States may have discovered that tariffs do not automatically determine where Canadian aluminum goes. Markets matter. Prices matter, shipping routes matter, and customers matter. If Europe offers better economics, some Canadian aluminum will go to Europe. If America offers better economics, more aluminum can flow south again. Canada's producers will ultimately follow the market, but the political environment determines how many choices they have, and Canada's latest strategy is designed to increase those choices. That may be the biggest shift of all. For years, Canada and the United States treated their aluminum relationship as almost permanent. Now both governments are thinking strategically. Washington wants domestic production. Ottawa wants domestic resilience. Washington wants secure supply. Ottawa wants diversified markets, and both countries are competing for investment. The result is a new North American aluminum landscape. The old model was based primarily on efficiency. The new model is increasingly based on resilience, and resilience costs money. But governments are increasingly willing to pay that price, because supply chain security has become a national priority. So what happens next? The immediate question is the August 19th tariff deadline. If Ottawa and Washington reach a deal, some pressure on Canadian aluminum producers could ease. Canadian shipments to the United States could recover, and North American supply chains could stabilize. But even then, Canada's diversification strategy is unlikely to disappear. The investments have already been made. The European relationships are developing. The East-less technology is moving forward, and Canadian companies have learned that alternative markets can exist. If the talks fail, the shift could accelerate. More Canadian aluminum could move toward Europe. More producers could seek customers outside the United States. And Ottawa could increase its support for domestic production and exports. Either way, the aluminum industry is entering a new era. The United States will remain a major customer. But Canada is no longer looking at the American market as its only destination, and that is what makes this story bigger than a tariff dispute. Canada is trying to turn a vulnerability into an advantage. The United States imposed tariffs to protect its aluminum industry. Canada responded by protecting its own industry, investing in new technology and searching for new markets. The result could be a Canadian aluminum sector that is more diversified, more technologically advanced, and more focused on low-carbon production than before. And if that happens, Washington may have unintentionally helped accelerate exactly the shift it was trying to prevent, because tariffs can change trade flows. But once supply chains change, they do not always go back. A Canadian producer that finds a profitable European customer has a reason to keep that relationship. A European manufacturer that discovers a reliable Canadian source has a reason to keep buying. And a Canadian government that sees the benefits of diversified exports has a reason to continue investing. That is how temporary trade disputes can create permanent economic changes. Canada is not cutting the United States out. It is not abandoning North America. And it is not suddenly becoming independent of the American economy. But it is building alternatives. Cleaner aluminum, new technology, European customers, domestic demand, and stronger supply chains. The question is whether those investments will be enough to transform Canada's position, because aluminum may be only the beginning. If Canada can turn its aluminum sector into a global leader in low-carbon production, the same strategy could eventually be applied to steel, critical minerals, energy, and advanced manufacturing. And that would represent a much larger economic shift. The real battle is not simply over the price of aluminum, it is over who controls the supply chain, who produces it, who processes it, who buys it, and who has the alternatives when politics disrupts trade. Canada is now trying to make sure it has those alternatives. And as the August 19th deadline approaches, the aluminum industry could become one of the most important pressure points in the entire Canada-US trade dispute. Because Canada has something American industry still needs, and America has something Canadian industry still needs. That makes aluminum more than a commodity. It makes it leverage. And Canada's new strategy is designed to make sure that leverage does not belong entirely to Washington. The next few months will show whether Canada can turn that strategy into lasting economic power. But one thing is already clear. The old aluminum trade is changing, and the country that adapts fastest may have the advantage.